The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM. For our second session today, we welcome a panel of 3 educators from Metro Nashville Public Schools, presenting information and strategies about how to ensure equitable access for all learners. Would the panel please join me on screen? Debbie McAdams is Executive Director of the Department of Exceptional Education at Metro. Molly Hegwood is the Executive Director of the Office of English Learners. And Dr. Joe Gordon is the Coordinator of School Counseling. To the panel, thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. I look forward to learning more about how we can support students who may have more identified needs to ensure access to good education for all.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Dr. Clark shared, I'm Debbie McAdams with Metro Nashville Public Schools, and I'm the Executive Director for the Department of Exceptional Education. I have the privilege of co-presenting today with 2 of my friends and colleagues, and I will let them introduce themselves. And just as Dr. Clark just said, please, we welcome questions. We are all learning together. So please put those questions in the chat and we will be happy to respond. Molly?
Good morning. My name is Molly Hegwood. I am the Executive Director of the Office of English Learners here in Metro Nashville Public Schools.
Right. And again, I'm Joe Gordon, one of the 3 coordinators of school counseling services here for Metro Schools, and just happy to be a part of the presentation today.
Absolutely. And we always like to start with our mission. We deliver a great public education to every student every day, and that is the mission of Metro Nashville Public Schools. In addition, our vision statement, you'll see here in blue, we really focus on that every student is known. And we have a tremendous amount of students, whether you're a rural district or a suburban district, we all have the same concerns, areas of challenge, areas of growth. So we want to share some of the things that we have done this year to help with our student populations of our EL learners and our students with disabilities. But it is very important that every school, every teacher realizes that every student is known in our district. We have a lot of things in place. We have navigators that reach out to our students on a weekly basis. So every single student in our district has a touch point with somebody outside of their classroom teacher. So we feel very strongly about that. Molly's going to talk about our learning outcomes, what we'll be doing over the next hour with one another.
So we'll start off with learning about the MNPS students and the students that we serve. Metro Nashville's EL population has grown rapidly, and I know like many of the districts across the country. So we'll talk through how we have worked through the growth and what processes we have put in place to better support our students. We've also made significant shifts. So we'll talk about those shifts and why we made some shifts in our practices to ensure that we are offering the continuum of support. So we'll talk through those supports at the end of the presentation as well.
All righty. And to give everyone just a glimpse as to what Metro Nashville Public Schools looks like from a demographic standpoint, we serve approximately 80,000 students. And our ethnicity breakdown, Black, Hispanic, Latino, and white are our predominant ethnicities in our district. But Metro Schools is an incredibly diverse school district, and we do our best to make sure that we are providing equitable services to all of our students, regardless of background, race, ethnicity, and gender, what have you. So we pride ourselves on that. Looking a little bit more deeply, we have we have 159 schools across our district with 126 spoken languages in all of those schools, and we have 21% of our students in M&PS are English learners. Looking at the breakdown of our students with disabilities, as you can see, we have a wide assortment of disabilities that are represented across our school district. We have students in every disability category, including functionally delayed and intellectually gifted, which is not recognized under IDEA. However, we wanted to make sure that we show you kind of our global breakdown of students with disabilities. We wanted to show you the raw numbers as well. Sometimes in a pie graph like that, it can limit how we see our students. So even in some of our categories, we may only have 1 or 2 students, but we have a great number of our students with disabilities in our school district.
Yep, and you'll see from this data that it represents what you see nationally. The majority of our students have a specific learning disability, which I'm sure is the same case in all of the districts that are here today too.
Thank you. Next up, we wanted to share kind of our percentages of our students that are in general education curriculum. Over the past several years, we've been working to make sure that our students with disabilities are included as much as possible in the general education curriculum. And as it stands in the 2020-2021 school year, 74% of our students were included in the general education curriculum.
And for those special education directors on the call, this is our indicator 5 data. I know many of you are very familiar with that. So we had in our district probably 10 years ago, we had the lowest indicator 5 percentages in this state of Tennessee. So that is something, like Joe said, that we have focused on throughout the years, because we know in order for any of our students to make progress, they need to be in that gen ed setting. They need to be accessing gen ed content, as Joe has said. So we went from 30% to 74%. So, and you have to do a lot of changes with that and a lot of education for all of our teachers and a lot of professional learning.
All right. And looking at the cross-section of students with disabilities and English learners, roughly 11% of our student population has an IEP. And that's also reflected in our English learners. So of all of our English learners across the district, 19% of them have an IEP as well.
So I know some of you are familiar with these heat maps and others are not. But this is our accountability heat map that we get from the Tennessee Department of Education. And as you can see from this, it shows our district success rate on achievement testing, chronic absenteeism, English language proficiency, and graduation rate. The English language proficiency one we've highlighted there in the box, it observes that the K-12 students progress towards their language goals on the access assessment. And the growth standards are differentiated based on the student's proficiency level. M&PS EL students met their double AMAO target last year for English language proficiency, and we received the highest accountability score for growth for our EL students overall. So we're really proud of this, and we saw similar trends in our EL students with disabilities. So that'll be on the next slide. So here's the same heat map, but narrowed down for students with disabilities. And as you can see there, our English learners that also have a disability met their growth targets as well. So we are really excited to share some of the practices that we have implemented across these 2 groups to get us where we are today. All right, so as we have started this conversation with various teams, we always do this activity. You won't be able to participate like we would in a normal setting, but we want you to think about this. These myths and realities are all challenges that we have experienced and gaps in knowledge. So this is a great starting point for us to get teams thinking. So let's just do the first one, and you can just think about it yourself and think about what your answer might be in your context. So we say all students must participate in the MTSS RTI academic and dyslexia screening process, the universal screener. So think about that for a second. So this one is true. We have really worked hard to make sure that 100% of our students are screened. We often have questions. Does this student that just got here 2 days ago need to be screened? And the answer is yes. We are consistent. We make sure this happens. We want to be able to determine the best placement for all students. And so all students must participate in this process. All right. Placing a student in a skills-based intervention is a pipeline to special education. This is false, but is often a myth that we are working through as our district, and you may be experiencing the same thing. EL teachers especially are very hesitant to put a student in skills-based intervention. They're worried that this will automatically end up that the student has an IEP later on, is in special education. And that is not the purpose of an intervention. So we want to make sure that students that need that intervention receive that intervention, and then hopefully close the gap so that that student does not need that intervention anymore. But equal access is a theme that you will hear throughout this presentation. And so we always want to make sure a student has access to an intervention if they need that. Academic interventions can benefit EL students. This one is true. We have a mindset sometimes that students can't access interventions, and it's our job to make sure that they can. And so we put scaffolding in place, we do various things to make sure that if an EL student needs that intervention, they can benefit, and oftentimes they will benefit from having that intervention. And our last one, EL students must have a minimum access score of 3.5 to be placed in intervention. So this is false. And we caution anyone that's placing a lot of stress on a certain language proficiency level, because we don't want to make it so that a student doesn't have access to an intervention if they need it. And many times, sometimes, students won't get to that level without support. And so if we put that 3.5 or any number in place, then that could potentially make it and become a civil rights issue for that student, because they may not get to that proficiency level that is then the next step. So we have really worked, and this has taken us time to get out of our minds of let's look at a language proficiency level. Now we want to look at multiple data points to make sure we're making the right decision. And we want to make sure that the decision is best for the student and is not based solely on reaching a certain language proficiency. So this one is false. So if you want to think about that one in your own setting, I bet you'll have some of those similar stories as well. So as we usually do this presentation to our teams and we say, okay, let's go through these myths and realities. And there's a lot of people that have some feelings because they've done it a certain way for a very long time. And we say, we understand, but we have to understand why there may need to be a shift in some of our practices. So it's important to ground your work and your explanations in the why. So Debbie and I are going to talk through these two pieces from our lenses. The U.S. Department of Education and Justice has really given us some wonderful guidance related to ensuring English learner students participate meaningfully and equally in programs. So I recommend you Googling both of those documents so you have them in your back pocket. But one thing about these documents that you will see throughout is this word around access. So if you have processes or protocols in place that don't have access points for English learners, this could be an issue for you. So what we were seeing was that we had some pieces of our processes in place in our district that did not give them equal access. And so as we looked back through this different process, we said, we need to change this because this isn't quite where we should be. So really helping to make sure that students can participate meaningfully and equally in all programming. And that includes the full continuum of supports.
So like Molly said, we really had to do that mind shift change because we were in this area where people were saying, oh, well, we can't assess a student yet. We can't go through child fine obligations because the student has just come to us. We don't have enough information. So we really had to change the mindset of both of our teachers and our assessment specialists. And we'll go into some more detail about this, but it's very, very clear that all of our students have to have that equal education opportunity, which Molly talked about with the equitable access, but that includes an evaluation for IDEA eligibility that measures the student's disability related deficits, not their English speaking ability, but their disability, right? And you have to rule out that English language proficiency. It is very, very important. Again, this was a mind shift for our district, and we had to make a lot of changes with this. We have to make sure we're utilizing assessments that are appropriate for our English language learners. So we worked collaboratively with Molly's team and our assessment specialists, and also that we're doing these assessments in the student's home language. Okay, when we're speaking with our parents and when we're actually doing the assessments with our students, we have to have somebody there. This is very clear under IDEA that speaks that student's language. Okay, so again, this took time to get there because we were still having those conversations like, oh, no, we've got to wait. We've got to wait. There's no waiting. Okay, if we suspect a disability, we are under child find obligations. And again, it was a lot of training and a lot of mind shift change. So if you're not there yet with your district, you'll get there, and we can give you some strategies.
Yeah, and know that we're still making improvements.
Right. Exactly.
But we have made some big shifts in the last couple of years to move in this direction, but we still have work to do.
All right. Speaking of the work that needs to be done, RTI and the multi-tiered systems of supports, this is nothing new to most school districts. But within MNPS over the last couple of years, we've been doing our best to move from a mindset of thinking about the tiered interventions and supports that we provide to students, instead of looking at the academic supports and the behavioral supports in silos, and the MTSS triangle, as it's shown here, was traditionally split in half, with academics on one side and behavior on the other. But over the last years, we've made a concerted effort to begin looking at those as a whole. We understand that students who have academic concerns may have behavioral concerns as well, and vice versa. So we want to make sure that we're looking at students who need supports. We want to look at them holistically, and to not look at things separately. And to that point, and moving more into our conversations about collaboration, this allows for our counseling support, our behavioral supports, to work directly with our students who have academic concerns. It truly ensures that we're working together, and specifically for our conversation today, how do we integrate counseling supports while supporting our students with disabilities and our English learners. Taking a step back, if you look at our national model from the American School Counseling Association, our model of practice, there's several areas that are going to be critical to this conversation. If you'll go to the next slide, Debbie. If you look specifically in our school counseling model, in the management area, parts that are important to this conversation are, what are our beliefs as school counselors? What do we believe our students are capable of? And then in our mission and vision statements, like how do we integrate our beliefs about all students in the ways that we want them to be successful? As school counselors, we focus on the academic, college and career, and social emotional improvements of all of our students. So we want to make sure that we have a belief and we have a mission and vision that truly encapsulates our belief that all students, regardless of disability and regardless of English language learner status, they can all be successful. When we look at program planning, we want to make sure that we're analyzing our school data. That includes our English learners data, our students with disability data, and we want to make sure that we are identifying and establishing annual goals. How, as a school counselor, can I impact goals that are unique to my school or specific to my school district as well? And then we want to make sure that if there are action plans associated with those goals, that we put those into place. And And if you'll click ahead, and when we are delivering services, part of our delivery of services includes looking at appraisal and assessment data, and then making advising students, advising parents, consulting and collaborating with other stakeholders, our EE department and our EL department, and then making appropriate referrals as a part of that process. So as a whole, school counseling should be embedded in any practice that's available to support our students with disabilities, as well as our English learners.
And just like Joe is saying, like that, so that was again a mind shift change for our school counselors too, because gone were the days where we're going to say, oh, let's just wait to see how the student does. Let's just, we have to make sure that we're addressing the needs as we see them. And so it was with our assessment specialists, with our school counselors, because the school counselors are a huge part of our support team process. So we had to make sure kind of that we reshifted everybody's thinking with that. So we're so grateful that we can all collaboratively work together.
So as Debbie talked about the shifting of thinking in our last presentation right before us, they were talking a lot about the groundwork and on the ground. This part kind of zooms out a little bit. So as we were thinking about as a support hub, which is our central office, how can we help make this shift happen across over 150 schools with over 18,000 English learners? So it was definitely a process that we had to think through systematically. How can we make this happen and go at it in the right way? So what we looked at were these 4 pieces. We wanted to make sure, as we looked at our MTSS process, how are we ensuring that this is a culturally and linguistically responsive process? So looking at, as the teams come together, are they equipped to make these decisions based on students' proficiency levels and other factors? Are we looking at this through the intervention process? Are we looking at these cultural and linguistic responsive practices during assessment? And then also in the tier 1 practices. And then thinking about, as we are looking at the MTSS structure as a whole, are we providing the most effective tier 1 learning environment for our multilingual learners? Oftentimes we look back and look at the ILP and the structures that are happening in that tier 1 classroom, and there are pieces that we need to fine tune in order to better support students at that tier 1 level. As a support hub, we also we help and support the MTSS teams at the school level. And they have leadership teams and data teams that work together to determine placement of students during intervention. With that many stakeholders in these situations, we had to be strategic around our communication of these changes, because we have different people and different experience levels with English learners. And so we have schools now, every school in MNPS has an English learner. So some schools are very well versed in this information and others are not. So we wanted to make sure these school-based teams really understood language proficiency. How do they use language proficiency to assist in determining placements? And then also, how are they continuing to build capacity of other stakeholders in their buildings to make decisions? And finally, we really narrowed in, how are we ensuring EL students have access to all tiered supports? The last presentation talked about that conflict that sometimes happens. Should the student receive interventions? Should the student have EL support during this time? And we deal with that every single day. But we say to all schools, if a student needs an intervention, they have to get an intervention and EL services. It's not a choice, they get both. And so we really are still working on ensuring students have all access to all supports that they need. We're very lucky in Nashville that we have personalized learning time, which is when interventions take place. So this block is a grade level or school-wide block of time where students can receive various levels of support. This creates a differentiated support that students can have. When we first started with PLT, we had many schools that were offering EL services during this time. And as we were first figuring it all out, we thought, okay, this might work. But then what we found was, if schools were really relying on this block, to provide EL services, it did not allow for access to anything else. And so schools would often say, well, they're getting their EL services during this time. So what are we going to do? How are we going to give them the other pieces? So we had to kind of pull back on offering EL services during PLT, because we looked at where else in the day could this happen to free up EL students' schedules to fully participate in personalized learning time. And so we can have additional language support during personalized learning time, but really try to stay away from any type of direct services during this time in case a student needs intervention or special education services. So we talked a little bit about this individual student decision. So as we were working through this change with our schools, we put students at the center and we talked through where we were previously and where we should be now. So what we looked at was grade levels, length of time in school. And as you can see on the left, many times based on this student's English language proficiency level, which you can see in the top right corner there, was 2.5. A school would have automatically said, the student probably isn't ready for intervention yet. They haven't been here very long. Let's just continue with language support during PLT. We wanted schools, and we are really moving in this direction, to make sure we were looking at the whole student and not just those English language proficiency levels. So now schools are using those as a piece of data or source of data, but they're really looking at other factors. So where we're going is that we are looking at the universal screening. We're looking at the growth over time and not just where they are now. We're looking at work samples. We're looking at end of module tasks. And then we're also looking at how well the accommodations in the student's individual learning plan are being implemented. We also look at the IEP and 504 if applicable. And then we say to schools, think of the student and where would this student go based on your school setting? And we have had schools now really thinking about, well, you know what, maybe the student does need an intervention. The student has been in school since kindergarten and they're now in second grade and they're not making progress. So we're really excited about how we're shifting that away from looking solely at the language proficiency level and years in school and moving towards looking at the whole student and those data pieces.
So as Molly said, this took time and we had to really shift our thinking. And then this brings us to, again, the evaluation piece, which I know our friends in Murfreesboro spoke about too. But we have really been the biggest takeaway that I hope, one of the biggest takeaways that you guys can leave with today is that when you're moving towards this model is that you make sure that you're training your EL and your assessment specialist school counselors side by side. Okay, bring everybody together and have these conversations in these professional learning opportunities side by side. Don't be doing them in all separate things. We're all in different departments. In fact, school counseling's in a whole other division than Molly and I even are, but we've got to bring everybody together to do that training side by side. We have to have that ongoing consultation between your assessment specialist and your EL, which we saw from Murfreesboro City Schools earlier today. You had your assessment specialist and then one of your directors coming together to make sure those conversations and that professional learning was happening. EL has the best practices for our EL students. Okay, so they have to be sitting at the table at all times to make sure the teams, school level teams and district level teams know what those best practices are for our EL learners. Interpreters. I know not every district is as fortunate as we are with the amount of interpreters that we have, but this is a crucial point when you're going through the assessment process for our students that we suspect might have a disability. We have trained all of our interpreters so they understand the assessments, they understand child find, they understand what is an IEP, they understand the psychological reports. We have incredible teams that work together every day. In fact, there's specific interpreters that they request because they've done so much professional learning with us, and they're really doing now the professional learning with the other interpreters. But this is very important. And we don't always have enough interpreters either. So we're fortunate that our district used some of our ESSER funds to utilize a contracted company that we can call at any time to get an interpreter with all of our different languages on the phone. So we utilize that a lot also. And we went through an entire RFP process. But I'm going to continue to advocate that whether you're a school level staff or a district level staff, you've got to have access to those interpreters. We've got to be providing those assessments in their students' home language. We've got to be having conversations with parents in their home languages, and we've got to be sending home information. For those of you who are in the state of Tennessee, Easy IEP has translation that you can get all of your IEPs translated, which is a great resource that we've decided to pay that extra amount for. So just some tidbits there for other districts. And as Molly talked about, just making sure that all of our special populations are included in those MTSS and data team meetings. We're talking about students with IEPs. We're talking about students who are EL. We're looking at ILPs. We're looking at the IEPs. And we're going to go into more later in our presentation about that, how we look at ILPs and IEPs together and kind of that cross-reference and the intersection of that. But this is just some of the things that we've done that if you're moving towards this in your district, these would be some of our recommendations. Do everything hand in hand.
So as we talk through the kind of looking at the assessment piece, throughout the whole process is we talk about how do we know if a multilingual learner also has a disability versus a difference. And we often start with just using this quote of eliminate all other possible explanations for this underachievement. And so on the next slide, you can see some of the research-based explanations that we have looked at and that we talk through with school teams. Some of the things were also mentioned as well with the presentation prior to, really looking at a student's proficiency in their first language. We dig into that and look at how proficient they were in that language and what that looks like as it crosses over into English. What did their education look like? Did the parents and families have any other concerns? Did the student read or write in their first language prior to joining us in MNPS? Those literacy skills will transfer over into English. And so we want to make those connections for the student. If the student did not, that could be a possible explanation for some of the underachievement. This is always fun to look at when it comes to talking to teachers, because the behaviors that you see on the left are sometimes things that we hear from teachers. We often say to teachers, well, think about what would happen if you went to Japan and you were sitting in a classroom in Japan for 7 hours a day, and people were speaking to you only in Japanese. And then look at these behaviors that you see here on the left. Could you possibly start with some of these behaviors? If it were me, I'd probably become inattentive and doing something else. But it's not because I am not trying to learn or that I can't. It's that I may not be understanding what's happening, or I may be getting somewhat distracted in the learning. So these are some things, some behaviors that we often look through when those are reported to us to say, could it possibly be that they're just still learning the language, and potentially you're seeing some impulsive or inattentive behaviors related to that.
Right. Thank you, Molly. So we've kind of been walking through the process. We have making sure that students have access to core, making sure that our students are receiving multiple our tiers of support. If we suspect that a student has a disability, that we go into a support team and we go into our child find obligations. So now we're at the point where student may have an IEP and an ILP. Okay. And we like to show this visual to schools when we're doing our cross collaborative training, so people can see these are two separate documents, and we're going to provide services as documented in both the IEP and the ILP. It's not one or the other, which has been said over the years for many, many years. We hope we don't hear that anymore. But it's important that we're looking at that there's an IEP process and there is an ILP process. Okay. And that both of these things are going to bridge those gaps for our students who are both English language learners and have an IEP, where your IEP really focuses on that skill deficit and your ILP is really focusing on those standards. Okay. So aligning the IEP and the ILP, Again, this is just something that we utilize in our training. The IEP is a legally binding document, but that does not mean that we're going to sit in a meeting and say, oh, we're not going to follow the ILP because under federal law, we have to follow the IEP. No, we're following both. Okay. And we're making sure that that EL teacher is sitting in the IEP team meetings. They are part of that IEP team and part of a support for that student. You guys all know, many of you are special educators on this call today. They're updated minimum yearly. They're a fluid process with the IEP. And you saw the narrative that it contains present levels and the services are based on the student's goals. With your ILP, it is a state rule. We have to have ILPs. They're updated yearly. They're monitored. Again, they're monitored as part of the MTSS and data team meetings. And they're really looking at the service model and the accommodations piece. So you're going to see some similarities. So a student who has an IEP and an ILP, you're going to see some similarities amongst those accommodations, but we have to make sure that we're implementing both and providing services to all of our students with both. Molly, did you want to add anything to the IEP and ILP?
I don't think so. I think one of the things that you spoke about, but I want to re-elevate, is that the two work together and one does not trump, for a better, lack of a better word, the other. And so that also goes into the services piece that we'll talk about next in the next slide. Now that we have both an IEP and an ILP, we are now in Metro Schools in a place where we're making sure every student gets all the services they need. And this can be challenging. So if you have a school of 400 English learners, and we have potentially 10% of those students that have a disability, we need to be able to map that out with the school teams. And Debbie will dive into what that looks like in a little bit. We also need to look at what does that instruction look like? How can we build up those schools to be able to monitor and collaborate, and also ensuring that that EL teacher is a part of the process. That's new for some schools because that may not be something that they've done in the past, but if we are having English learner, that EL teacher should be there to speak about the student's ILP and also language development, because that does fall into the, how that IEP might be executed as well. But ultimately, we work with the schools individually to support them and again, build capacity, because we have so many English learners. They cannot just rely on us as a support hub or central office. We have to build capacity. So we've really shifted our model to building schools up with this information, as opposed to relying so much on us to facilitate this process.
Yeah, and I think we've seen a lot of movement in the right direction with our schools. And it started with us modeling it as support hub or central office, because they need to see us all working together and we need to be modeling that. So like just about a month ago, we got a phone call from a principal who was struggling with one of our students who happens to have both an ILP and an IEP. So Molly and I went out together to support that team and to model, hey, you need to bring your EL teacher into this conversation. And we need to figure out together how we can support the students. So really starting at that support hub level, but like Molly said, we can't be in 159 schools. So we've really got to build the capacity of our schools, but doing that modeling, bringing Joe into the conversation, bringing that school council at the school level into the conversation makes a world of difference. I know we throw out the word collaboration all the time in education, but nobody can educate a student on their own. Okay. It has to be a collaborative effort. And this is difficult. We know this is very difficult, especially in today's world where we have a huge shortage of teachers. But there are some things that you can do. And I've addressed some of these already, like training the interpreters in the special ed process. Okay. The interpreters are your voice, but they still need to understand. We have a lot of, special ed is complex. Okay. And our interpreters need to understand the pieces of it too, so they can help our families understand it. Again, the training and doing that side by side, okay, with our school counselors. We have EE coaches in our district that help support the schools, our assessment specialists. We have EL coaches in our schools. Our goal is for the EE and EL coach to be going into those schools like Molly and I did to that one school and supporting those teachers and making sure that our students are getting all the services that they need, understanding how that IEP and ILP work together. And then the whole MTSS training, which has been that has been a blessing for our district, is just having that structure that Joe talked about earlier with the academic and behavioral support for all of our students. Okay, and that they get that tiered level support both in academics and behavior.
Debbie, I'm going to add one thing about the collaboration with interpreters. So our team supervises the interpreters, and one piece that's really important when you are working with an interpreter in a parent meeting is the pre-meeting. So think about the level of academic vocabulary that is going to be talked about during that IEP meeting or any level of academic meeting. If you need to front load some of that to the interpreter so they have a few minutes to think about what that looks like in their language, because that is not everyday language that an interpreter would use. So Debbie's team is really great too. The school psychologists try to get those IEPs over to the translators early so that the translator is able to look through that IEP. You're moving in all kinds of, I don't know what's happening. It's all good. It just keeps changing. It's good. But that's really important to set the interpreter up for success. Otherwise, they're going in cold, and it can be really challenging for them to best communicate all of that information to the parent in a way that the parent understands.
Yeah, so just like we provide our parents with their IEPs 48-hour notice, we're providing our translators with that information. Okay, we've given them access to Easy IEP, and same with our psych reports. I'm glad you mentioned that, Molly, because that is something that we've just started really working on this year, because that's not been happening. And our coordinator of translation services had made that request, so we've given him access to Easy IEP so he can pull records and help prepare the translators before they go into these meetings. Again, so we were talking about collaboration. Again, it's very, very difficult to find time in the day with our shortages, with our master schedules. So we just wanted to throw this in here. These are some things that we share with our schools, making sure you're scheduling block of time. If you're the 8th grade special education teacher, make sure you have that common planning time with your 8th grade teachers, same with your EL teacher. Go out for breakfast. I know we don't, as teachers, we don't really get to go out for lunch, but on those PD days, go out to lunch and have that time for collaboration. Specials, when all of your students are going to specials, related arts, that's a great time. Just even passing in the hallway, having those conversations in the faculty room, rethink your department meetings and how to make sure that collaboration is occurring. Again, the MTSS and data meetings are another great opportunity to be talking about students and where we need to go and support them. And of course, there's always email and text messages and everything else in our world of technology. As horrible as COVID was, it's really taught us how to just get on a Teams call or a Zoom call or whatever you use in your district and have those quick kind of pop-ins with one another to make sure that we're addressing all of our students' needs. So as Molly had mentioned and Joe has mentioned, we have to make sure that our students have equitable access to everything. We have to make sure they're accessing core and that they're getting all their intervention time and they're getting their special ed service times and they're getting their ILP times. And I think our friends in Murfreesboro said, they struggle with that as a district too. And you're like, okay, we need to go to school till 6 o'clock at night because there's just not enough hours in the day to get everything students need. We have to do mandatory recess time. I mean, there's just a lot. So one of the things that we have done in our district is the schools have to present their master schedule to us prior to it being approved, prior to it being implemented in the school. So I feel like the whole month of March and April, we are bouncing around to all of our different schools to review their master schedule. And we go as a team, as a support hub team. It's EL, it's school counseling, it's the MTSS director, it's special ed, it's all the other every department is there and represented, and we go through each school. Well, right now we're just doing it with high schools. We're hoping to bring it to middle schools and then elementary. We go through each school's master schedule, and for each department, they have specific questions that when they're building their master schedule, they're reviewing. Okay, because we can't make this progress unless things will fit into the master schedule. We can't say, oh, we can't do that because it doesn't fit into the master schedule. Okay, Molly's very fortunate just within her department. She's got a school counselor that focuses specifically on EL. She was able to have that position, and it works really closely with Joe's people. But things that we ask when they're developing their master schedule. Are the services, is your schedule aligned to make sure that you can provide those services that are outlined in a student's IEP? Are you offering a continuum of services? Okay, we talk a lot about that in special education. You can't say, oh, our school doesn't offer that. No, every school offers all continuum of services. Okay, whether a student needs intervention or they're on the academic alternative diploma path, or they need some behavioral support, your master schedule has to reflect that in some way. Are you providing that intensive intervention support? For our students who have a learning disability, we feel very strongly that they need that intensive intervention, okay? They need more than that tier 3 intervention is providing. They need that special ed intervention, whether they have a learning disability in reading, math, or writing. So that's something that we're looking for. Are students participating in the alternate academic pathway, and are you utilizing those AAD courses? Are your EL students with disabilities scheduled in both the EL services and your IEP services, which I think that we have continually talked about throughout this presentation, because they are entitled to both and need to receive both. And is there time in your schedule to make sure that we're meeting the social, emotional, and behavioral needs? I'm sure you guys are all seeing in your districts, or we're seeing in our districts, that we have a lot more students that maybe had some adverse childhood experiences, are really struggling with just even coming back to school after not being in school during the COVID year. And there's just been a lot of trauma, which we are dealing with constantly. And I know you guys are too. And again, that's why it's so important that we work with school counseling and all of the different departments. So those are just some of the questions that we push out there to our schools as they're building their master schedule. Molly and Joe, did you want to add anything to the master scheduling?
The only thing that I would add is this part is incredibly critical, because we want to make sure that we're meeting all the needs of an ILP and an IEP for our students, but we also want to make sure that during not only the master scheduling process, but the annual review process, that we're ensuring that we're not making changes that have unintended consequences that might put a student at a disadvantage to being able to graduate on time. So we want to make sure that our schedules and our IEPs and ILPs are ensuring that students have the ability to access all of the different areas of education, whether that be advanced academics, whether that be our elective focus opportunities in our high school, but at the end of the day, are our students getting all of the credits they need to be able to graduate on time? And that's why it's incredibly important to have an interdisciplinary team that's looking at these things together, and having the school counselor invited to the IEP meetings, or at least consulted prior to making any changes, so that we can ensure that we're not creating a hole in a student's 4-year plan that would prevent them from graduating on time.
Yeah. And Joe, that leads me to think about too, is the work that we've been doing to make sure that the school counselors are aware of transition planning through the IEP process, and making sure that's aligning with the 4-year plan. And they know what I'm sorry, the emergency radio is going off in our school, to make sure that the school counselor is aware of that transition planning, because that should match. We shouldn't see differences in that. Mm-hmm. So. Another thing that we do in addition to the master schedule is what's called mapping. And this started years ago when we really pushed out an integrated service delivery model. And we, as a department, went out to every single school and mapped their services. Now schools they know it, they've learned it, and they're doing it on their own. Once in a while, they might call somebody from one of our departments to come out and assist them. But what we do is we pull every student's IEP and every service that student gets, and then every service that they get through their ILP too, their EL services. And we map it. We truly map it to make sure that there is time in the day for that student to receive those services, and we're not pulling them out of their core content. Okay. So again, that's where that master schedule comes into play, to make sure that there is time in the day for this to happen. So this is just one example. We don't put student names on. Well, we do sometimes put student names on it, but we don't put teacher or paraprofessional names on it, because the principal makes that decision. The principal decides who is teacher 1, who is teacher 2, who is teacher 3. But you can see here, like this student gets 2 sessions a week in a special ed setting for behavioral support. Okay, so we have to make sure that's going to happen throughout the day. So this ensures that your IEP service hours are being met. It ensures somebody is responsible for that. And it ensures that your EL times are happening also. Okay, so this is where you can sit down with a school and problem solve to make sure all that can happen, and a student's not going to school till 6 o'clock at night. So again, we started this probably 10, 12 years ago. It's a lot of work. Sometimes it takes an entire day to map a school, but it is so worth it. And it is what's best for our students, and it's best for our staff. And then the school administrators know exactly what's happening. And we're changing the maps constantly because our mobility rate in this district is tremendous. Like, we're constantly getting new kids in and new kids out. So you're constantly changing things. But then also our district is a student-based budgeting district. So if principals need additional funds to make sure they can meet the needs of all their learners, I'm asking for their map. We're looking at their map and seeing if there's holes in the day. Okay. And let's say you have a student who's having difficulty transitioning and they need help transitioning from one class to the next. We're looking at those paraprofessional schedules to see if somebody can do that within their building instead of adding another position to the budget. So some people do it on these nice, beautiful Excel spreadsheets, and then some people do it on stickies. Okay. So it just depends on how the school wants to do it. Some people use different colored stickies for the different grade levels. And they'll write, what the service hours are. We want to make sure that our teachers have lunch. We want to make sure that our teachers have a planning period. So we just wanted to share some examples with you guys about how all this works within the master schedule. All right. This has made a tremendous change in our district. All right. And I think I'm going to pass this over to Molly. So we have everybody where they need to be. They're accessing core. If we suspect a disability, we're moving forward with child find. We have trained our assessment specialists. We have trained our translators. And all this does not work perfect all the time.
So now as a district, I really feel like this is where we are.
Yeah.
We've got kids in places, and we are now having students in classrooms that maybe the teacher's not as equipped to serve those students. And so that's where we come in again and support the school to build capacity with meeting the needs of an English learner that also has a disability in their classroom. And we go back to the universal design for learning and what that looks like, and provide just instructional strategies based on what that student needs, but also what engages all learners. We're really fortunate as a school district that our district has prioritized ensuring that supports for English learners and students with disabilities and all diverse learners are part of the curriculum mapping and curriculum that we provide to teachers. And this has helped tremendously with making sure that a teacher doesn't get a curriculum that does not have supports for all students in that curriculum. So that's one piece that has been very helpful, but we're still working to make sure our teachers are able to provide that great, strong tier 1 support that we know our students need and deserve.
Yeah, and it's been great because our teaching and learning department, which our curriculum and instruction department is in the same division that Molly and I are in. So we've really been able to collaborate with them. Like, we've just rolled out a brand new English language arts curriculum, and we're about to do a math, as I know every other district will be also. But to make sure that special educators and EL are sitting at the table, and that we can give our teachers all those toolkits that they need to meet, like Molly just said, the diverse learners. And really teaching curriculum and instruction has really taken universal design, because sometimes it gets thrown under like a special ed and an EL thing, but it's not at all, as you guys know. And they've really taken that whole philosophy of universal design, and they're implementing it in all their professional learning when they're rolling out new curriculum. And then Molly and I will take it a step further with our team to look at like accommodations and modifications that are also needed in the gen ed setting. And so our coaches are now co-presenting on that. Same with co-teaching. We developed that presentation both with EL and special ed. Okay, so co-teaching might look different, but it's still the model of co-teaching for all of our special populations. So we've developed that together. So again, doing everything hand in hand makes a huge difference. So we hope that you guys were putting questions in the chat as they came to you throughout our presentation today. We appreciate this opportunity with MTSU and are very, very grateful and thankful that we were able to share some of our practices. We are always in a continuous improvement model. So we are always looking for new strategies and helping to support one another. So thank you for this opportunity. And We welcome any questions.
This is, wow. Lots of information, lots of great stuff, lots of strategies to use. So yes, we do have some questions. One of the early questions in the presentation was talking about some of the assessments you mentioned. Are you willing to share some of the assessments?
Is the question specifically like for child find assessments with the school psychologist, do we know, or?
And I am not sure in what context it was. So,
Okay.
but it was early in the presentation.
Okay, and if they want to email me directly, I can connect them with our director who really oversees school psychology. And I know they would be happy because there's been a lot of work in making sure that we are using culturally appropriate assessments. So if they want to email me directly, that would be great.
All right, great. Thank you. Okay, so we'll continue with questions. Is there something that can be done for a student with an SLD who qualified for ESL services only because of the SLD and their primary home language stating a language other than English?
So I think it would be really difficult to eliminate that the student only qualified for EL because of this speech language issue. But I think the root of the question are you able to make a change in some way? I think that when this happens, we always go back to what's in the best interest of students, and do we have enough data to support that decision? We rarely, if ever, change a student's home language survey because students, the dynamics in a person's home are always changing, and you become more proficient. So we really rarely, we don't change the home language survey unless there's a special situation. And so what we would do in this specific situation is really lean in and make sure that we are applying appropriate accommodations during the access testing so that the student is able to show what they know on the access test with thinking through their disability. And then we'd also really build up that both EL and EE teacher to make sure we're meeting both the IEP and ILP goals so the student can be proficient.
All right. A couple questions here about ILPs. How are you checking the ILPs during the 5-week data checks? Is it just teacher observation, or is there a monitoring tool that you use?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
So as you know, the state is in the process of doing some revisions based on TISA. So I do think that there might be some changes coming down the pipeline around the monitoring and updating of information. But currently we have a platform in Nashville that we've purchased with a general budget that we use to develop ILPs, and that also gives us oversight. After our first year of implementation of ILPs, we had at that time around 15,000 students. And that was one of the things that we were not able to do, was do a great job monitoring those. So after year one, our district put money in the general budget towards a software program that would allow the school principals to see the progress on their dashboard, and also us as an office to see the progress, and so that we're able to monitor and give feedback.
Do you know can you tell the name of that platform?
Elevation is what we use as a school district.
Okay. And then another ILP question. If a student has an ILP and an IEP, can the ESL teacher provide push-in services into the SPED pull-out class?
That's a very complicated question because we need to know more about the student's entire day and what that looks like. What we would say to that person is, hey, let's have the EL coach and the EE coach come together and look at the schedule and see what best meets the student's need. There are times when a student that's an English learner and has a disability spends the majority of their day in a more inclusive special education setting, and we might look at that. But otherwise, we really try to make sure the services are separate. So that we can make sure that we're getting the ILP goals and the IEP skill-based goals in separate settings. So the only time I could think about those really overlapping would be something like that. Debbie, can you think of anything?
Yeah, I'm thinking more, we probably see it more with our students who are on that alternate academic diploma
what I was
track.
thinking.
So they're spending, especially at our older grades, and they might be spending more of their time in a special ed setting. And that's where the EL teacher would come in. I mean, and we have special day schools in our district. We have community-based transition programs, and our EL itinerant teachers go into those settings. So it does happen, but again, it's individualized, and we look at, but like for a student with a specific learning disability, which is the majority of your students, you wouldn't want that EL service happening during that intensive intervention of reading instruction from the special ed teacher.
Right. Okay. Another question. How can a student exit EL services if the student has an IEP and the disability affects performance on WIDA access?
Well, I can answer this one. I think go back to the data that we showed at the beginning, and that it happens and students make growth and they exit if they're getting the appropriate supports in all continuum supports. So we have made great strides in that area by looking at all the different settings where the students there that has an IEP. How are we providing strong tier 1 instruction that's based in the content? How are we providing the needs in the IEP? And how are we providing language support during EL services? And when all those things work together, the student makes growth. And then for those on the ALT assessment, we're seeing students exit on the ALT assessment because they're also receiving both of those. So I think you go back to, are those students receiving the full continuum, high quality continuum of support, and then lean in there and to make your decisions.
Okay. A question from the beginning, early in your presentation about mind shift. We know some people can do a mind shift more easily than others. Were there some aha moments with some teachers who had a difficult time making the shift? What was helpful to making this mind shift for those who struggle with it more?
So what I think part of the pieces that really works so well is when they see all of us together giving the same message. So we tried to make sure that we had all stakeholders that were involved in the messaging, they're delivering that. So there was not any discrepancy in what the information looked like. So when we were talking about students with disabilities and English learners, Debbie and I were together versus Debbie delivering something to her team and I delivering something to mine.
Yeah.
So showing that and messaging that together was key. And then also developing third point documents that were there in writing. So it's not that Molly and Debbie say this is the case. It's actually Department of Justice that says this is the case. That was very helpful in shifting some folks that really just needed something in writing that said, hey, we really have to do this. It's best practice, but we also have to.
Right.
And I think also showing them the data, like when we could find pockets, like, now we have the heat maps, which Molly shared earlier in our presentation, that is very telling, but also finding those little pockets of data for specific students that we can share, and finding those teachers that are already doing it and having them speak to teachers, because a lot of times they don't want to hear from Molly and Debbie. They want to hear people that are doing it every day, because the teachers that are in the schools every day, they have a more difficult job than any of us. So they want to hear it from them. This is successful. Why? This is how we're doing it. Like just with our newest Reader Alt training, we had the school psychologist from a specific school do it with the EL teacher and the special ed teacher. So central office didn't even do that presentation this year. We had school level staff do that presentation with our support. So I think that's a good way to get mind shift change.
And I think when it comes to like an individual student's journey through all the different supports that they may need throughout their educational career, that's why it's important that Molly's team and Debbie's team work so hand in hand with our school counselors in making sure that they're up to date and trained and kind of know when the different levers are triggered throughout the process, so that when we begin at the very beginning stages of conversations of we have a student that has an academic or behavioral concern, and we begin the support team process, the school counselor is then equipped to ensure that all of the correct stakeholders are part of the process. It's not just the school psychologist at the beginning. It's not just consulting with a special ed case manager. We're ensuring that the EL team in the school is a part of the process. They truly can be that hub to ensure that all of the different information and all of the different services are considered along the way, so that we are beginning the process looking at the student from a holistic standpoint, as opposed to being halfway down the road. Is like, oh, we probably need to consider how this impacts EL, or how EL can inform this process, and vice versa. So that to me, from a school counseling standpoint, is very important.
Okay, all right. We've got two questions about interpreters. First question, how do you balance student confidentiality with the need for interpreters to understand the student's situation in order to communicate with the parents?
So we have 67 interpreters, full-time interpreters in MNPS. So they are MNPS employees. They have gone through all of those pieces of confidentiality and FERPA training. And so they're like any other MNPS staff member when it comes to that. And those are the majority of the folks that are doing our interpretation for the district. Like Debbie mentioned earlier, we have a contract service that we also use. And part of the contract request and the proposal that we have set up with that is related to confidentiality. And so we have made sure with our legal team that we don't have any issues in that area. So I'd recommend you running that by your legal team if you have any questions. We do not use anyone that is not an MNPS interpreter or through our contract service. We have educated schools on that. If you look at that Office of Civil Rights form around meaningful communication with families, it even specifically lists there that school districts must have a trained interpreter, and that you should not be using friends, family, neighbors, or students to do interpretation. So we're just very careful in that space. And Debbie's team is good about making sure that they are not, disclosing information outside of any of those services.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention too, the interpreters not having sidebar conversations with the families. They're always interpreting what the special ed teacher is saying, or the assessment specialist, or the EL teacher, or the principal. There's always somebody else there too, which I think is important.
Okay. And then, a question here. My district doesn't have a team of interpreters. What are some other resources to find interpreters for school districts that don't have many interpreters available, including maybe some resources for remote interpreting?
Yes. So I would make sure you kind of look into what your district is going to do, because there is an obligation as a school district to have interpretation services. It doesn't have to be a physical person that's on staff, but the district is responsible for having a process. And it really could be both a state and federal finding if there's not some sort of process for a certified interpreter. So I would ask that question just to see what that route would look like. We currently have a contract with AccuTrans. That's what we use right now, and we've been pleased with that, but we also use other contract services. So there are quite a few out there that you can look at. Because of the amount of money that we spend towards that, we do have 40% of our students that speak a language other than English at home. 20% are active English learners, but we have a sizable contract. We went through a request for proposal process to make sure that was a fair process. But I would make sure that you're using a consistent contract service. So I would ask your Title III director or your federal programs director for more information about that and what that process should look like.
And if you feel like you're kind of hitting a brick wall with this conversation, the document that Molly keeps bringing up. I mean, there's some data you can bring to your federal programs director. You can pull up IDEA, where it talks about in the procedural safeguards, it talks about in students' home language. So there's a lot of documentation you can bring to people to make them aware of what is required.
Okay. All right. Ms. That's all the questions from the chat. Ms. McAdams, Ms. Hagwood, Dr. Gordon, thank you for being with us today. This was a lot of great information and some strategies. I particularly love the mapping piece. That looks really, that is something that could be used at in any size district with any number of schools. And so that is a really great idea. Thank you for being with us today and sharing all this information on how we can work together and collaborate to support students in our schools. So with that, you may go off screen now. Thanks for being with us. We now conclude the 2023 Cross Collaborative. I'm Dr. Laura Clark, Director of the Center for Educational Media at MTSU's College of Education. Thank you for joining us today for the Cross Collaborative at Middle Tennessee State University.